Hi y'all! Since Muffin and I haven't been out in a while, we decided to have our own tiny clay food party. Today I'm going to show you how to make adorable miniature foods from air dry clay and acrylic paint. No oven required. To make bananas, I pulled off a small piece of clay and rolled it into a ball, then rolled the clay between my hands to create a cylinder. I split the cylinder in half to make 2 bananas, then pinched both ends to make them pointy and curved the clay around my thumb to give it a banana shape. I used a tool to press around the top edge and create a stem, then made a few more and set them aside to dry. To make tiny fried eggs, I formed a ball, then squished it down into an oval shape and used my fingertips to smooth out the edges. I used a pointy tool to score the clay where the egg yolk would be attached to the whites. This is a common clay joining technique that typically adheres better than simply squishing the 2 pieces together. I made 4 little fried eggs, then set them aside to dry. To make tiny pizza, I started with a little bit bigger ball and rolled it into a fat cylinder, then pinched one end to make it pointy while flattening out the top to form a rough triangle shape. I used a flat wooden tool to push up the pizza edges, then rolled down the top of my triangle to create a raised crust. I pushed down on the top corners to round out the edges of the crust. To make the pepperonis, I took 3 tiny balls of clay, flattened them, and again used the scoring method to attach them to the pizza slice. These pieces were so tiny, it was a little fiddly getting them all into place. I used the back flat end of a tool to press down the pepperonis and flatten them onto the slice. If you don't have clay tools, you could use the eraser end of a pencil and a toothpick to make your scoring marks. Plastic cutlery also make great improvisational tools. To make donuts, I began with a ball, then squished it down into a disc shape. I rolled the disc around in my fingers to fatten it back up and make the edges taller. Then I used a long pointy tool to poke a hole through both sides and gently rock the tool around in a circular motion to widen the hole. I carefully smoothed down the excess clay on the surface, trying to make it look like a smooth, doughy donut. I used a conical plastic tool to widen the edges of the hole a bit, then repeated the same process to create a couple more of these adorable tiny snacks and set them aside to dry. To create ice cream cones, I rolled a ball of clay with my fingers while pinching one end in a circular motion and pressing on the opposite end with my thumb or forefinger, eventually creating a cone. I also used a rounded tool to make room for a scoop of ice cream in the top of the cone. Next, I formed 2 balls of clay, one just a little smaller than the other. I squished the smaller piece of clay into a disc to be the bottom of the ice cream scoop. Then I used my pointy tool to score both pieces before joining them to one another. Once the ice cream scoop was ready to go, I scored the cone and joined the ice cream scoop to the top of the cone. I used the same method for another cone, but this time I wanted 2 scoops. I constructed this cone just like the first and made a scoop of ice cream to go on top. Then I created a second scoop of ice cream, scored the bottom of it and the top of the first scoop, and attached them to one another. After all my tiny foods were done, I let them sit and dry overnight. The next day, it's time to paint. Obviously bananas are yellow, so I used a lemon yellow to paint the base color on these. I'm using acrylic, but you could also use tempera or kids' activity paints. One of my banana stems broke off while I was painting, but that's okay. I went ahead and painted that piece yellow too, and saved it to glue back on later. These tiny guys can be a little tricky to paint because they're so small and like to flop around a lot. But since I'm using parchment paper underneath, they seem to dry really fast without sticking to the paper too much. After letting the first coat dry, I used white school glue to reattach my broken banana stem. Voila! Good as new. Next I mixed up some light yellow green and added a little bit to both ends of each banana to deepen the colors. I then used a medium brown to make tiny dots on each banana end for the stems and butts. Finally, I used a small thin brush to paint tiny brown spots and other details on my bananas, trying to make them appear as real as possible. I think they're pretty dang cute! To paint the eggs, I started with a bright white. Even though this air dry clay is quote-unquote white, it dries to more of a light grayish color, and I really wanted my egg whites to be white. I painted the tops, then turned them over and painted the bottoms too. Once they had dried, I used lemon yellow to paint the yolks, then mixed up an orange shade to add depth and detail to the yolks. This part of the process was a bit delicate, and I had to let the paint dry and repaint a few times to really get the look I wanted. I also mixed some light yellow and kind of went back and forth applying the lighter yellow and darker orange tones until it looked like a fried egg. I also decided I wanted runny yolks on a couple of my eggs, so I added some extra orange and yellow paint spilling out the side of the yolks and onto the whites. I think they look really fun. I would totally eat that if it were bigger and actual food. For my final eggy detail, I used a teeny tiny brush and black paint to add little black pepper flakes. Yum! To paint the pizza slices, I mixed up a light brown with a little white and orange, trying to make a nice freshly cooked bread shade. I painted the bottom of the crust first, starting at the pointy end and working my way up to the top. Once the bottom crust was filled in, I let that side dry for a while before I flipped the slices over and finished painting the top side and edges of the crust. I also put a few dots of brown on the surface of the pizza to break up the cheese tones a little. I mixed a yellow-orange shade for the cheese, then carefully painted that in around the pepperonis, leaving them white. Finally, I mixed a lovely deep red shade for the meat and painted it right onto the ronis. This tiny pizza is giving me real strong slumber party vibes, and I love it! To paint my donuts, I used the same brown bread shade that I used for the pizza crust. I painted the tops of the donuts brown while swirling my flat brush in the donut hole to make sure the insides got painted. I then used white paint to do icing around one of the donuts. I started by painting on top, then picked up the donut and held it while painting tiny scalloped edges for the icing. I mixed a lovely light pink and repeated the same process on the second donut, then used a very pretty light blue for the third. Finally, it's time to add sprinkles! I used my tiny brush that I had done the pepper flakes on the eggs with and mixed some pretty pastel colors to apply sprinkles to all my donuts. How fun is that? Now for the ice cream cones! Once again, I used a flat brush with that same brown bread shade I had mixed earlier. First, I carefully painted around the edges of the cone, avoiding the ice cream scoops. At some point, my double-decker ice cream scoop had fallen off, so I used a little bit of white school glue to stick them back together. Easy peasy. Once the glue had dried, I mixed a pretty shade of pastel pink to paint all over the single ice cream scoop. I was careful not to get the paint on the cone area and keep it just on the ice cream. I mixed a lovely yellow tan vanilla color for the next scoop and went with pastel blue for the final flavor. I used a small round brush to add tiny brown dots for toppings, perhaps chocolate chips? Then I mixed a berry red shade and applied it to the pink ice cream to look like cherries. Finally, I mixed a slightly darker brown to make crisscross hatch lines all over the cones. I don't know about you, but I think this food is looking yummy. Once the paint is dried, it's time to play. I set up an indoor picnic for Muffin and I to attend. I had a lot of fun messing around with placement and arrangement of the foods, and Muffin really enjoyed sitting in my plant jungle. I hope this tutorial inspires you to make some miniature food of your own. Bon appetit!